Hello. All right, so here to talk today about components and the future of the web. And so, like you said, I'm from Toronto at Shopify, and that's where you can find me on Twitter if you get mad about something. So I'm talking about building web apps with JavaScript, which is, I think, something that a lot of us do. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a history bit. So sort of romanticized, maybe inaccurate history of web apps, or what we call web apps. So in the early days of HTML and the web, when we were just starting to realize that we could do things more than just display read-only information, we were using, all interactivity was coming from forms and links. And so you have stuff like this. So forms and links are pretty good at doing formy, linky things. So, you know, like this is pretty okay, actually. Like if you're looking at it, and especially if you're coming from, you know, like before the web couldn't, well, not before, but like the web didn't do much else than this, and this is your only way to collect information and send it off to your server, it's not a bad way to do it. You can read this code and pretty much tell what it's going to do. Everything you need to know is right there. What fields are being sent, what HTTP method is being called, where it's being sent. Pretty straightforward. So that was cool for a while. Then JavaScript kind of grew up. It started becoming useful. Ajax became a thing. So now we could communicate with our servers asynchronously and have interfaces that are less obviously just forms and links doing formy, linky things. So now we have, say, the same form, collecting data and sending it to our PHP file to be processed through Ajax, rather than just by submitting the form on reloading the page. So this was sort of how we did things for a while. You got that on-click event handler there, calls a global function in our JavaScript file. We decided that was really bad. We thought that along with inline styles, which we also decided not to do, that inline event handlers were a bad idea because our markup is like this precious thing that we shouldn't contaminate with things like JavaScript. So we had this whole separation of concerns idea because separation of concerns is generally acknowledged to be a thing that you want in programming. So we decided that this is the way we were going to separate our concerns: HTML for content, JavaScript for behavior, CSS for presentation. And that was just sort of like the rules. Like this slide is probably in a million like intro to web development slides. I know it's in my intro to web development slides when I teach. So we decided to, instead of have that inline event handler, we move all that behavior out of our HTML and into some JavaScript, which quickly became jQuery-ish JavaScript. And so we decided that this was what our best practices looked like. Best practices looked like keeping all of your behavior and business logic in a JavaScript file that was querying the DOM and listening for events. So we called this best practices. So there was a couple years ago, if you follow the CSS world at all, Nicole Sullivan did a talk about how our best practices in CSS were killing us. About how we had this like ideal of the semantic web and this like perfect HTML that wasn't cluttered with classes or anything presentation based, and that was just really hurting us and making our websites really hard to maintain. And so people sort of got on board with that, and now we have other ways of dealing with CSS in our markup. So approaches like object-oriented CSS and like a bunch of other acronyms. So we decided that was okay. We got over it. So I sort of think that we kind of got there again. Sort of similar problem happened with JavaScript. So JavaScript web applications have become a lot more complex and interactive in the past like years. And just sort of maintaining that strict separation between our HTML and our JavaScript is like not really feasible in a lot of these situations. So I'm just going to sort of like look at some of the assumptions behind those supposed best practices, and why I think they're not right. So I don't think that HTML is really just for content. So this is something I've seen recently. So you end up with a lot of these basically like placeholder things in your markup. So this is like a select element, but without the JavaScript, it's not actually anything. There's no content there. It's just an empty select. But then once you add the JavaScript, you're pulling the content in from a JSON file or from some sort of external service. So I think it's hard to argue that in this case, our HTML represents content. And then you end up with things like your HTML5 input types. So this is a range slider. So it looks like you've got a lot of like logic and behavior in there, and there's no like content as you would generally expect it to be. You know, we've got business logic in here. We've got minimum values, maximum values, a default value, all sorts of stuff that you would generally consider to be in the range of JavaScript or like behavior. So I think HTML isn't just for content, and it never really was. I think it was sort of like a false dichotomy that sprouted up there. HTML has these like declarative APIs, these like nice elements that, you know, pretty easy to configure with just markup that keep all the, where you actually have things like logic and behavior in your markup. And we've always thought that that was okay. I mean, I think we did. So mentioned declarative APIs. So maybe take a second to talk about what those are, why we want them, and why they're good in HTML. So declarative versus imperative programming. Imperative specifies the steps you want to take to achieve the desired result. Declarative is saying what the result you want is, and then you leave the implementation up to something else. So either, depending on the language or framework you're working with, the implementation will either just be elsewhere, like other code that you wrote, or it's like leave the implementation up to the compiler or framework, whatever. So the idea of declarative programming is that you're abstracting away the explicit process and focus on what you want to happen, not how it's done, because that's like a solved problem. So the sort of standard example given for declarative versus imperative, I don't know if you can see that, but it's just like adding up the values in an array. So the imperative way to do that would be your standard for loop, where you're explicitly like creating a variable that starts at 0 and adding each time. The more declarative way of doing that would be to use something like an array reduce method. So it's more declarative in that you're saying what the output you want is, which is that you want to reduce that array to a single value. And you're leaving the implementation of, you know, creating your iterator variable and like increasing it each time and going through your loop. You're leaving that implementation detail up to just the basic array prototype methods. So there aren't a lot of like declarative languages that you encounter every day, but most popular one is probably SQL. So this is like a standard SQL query. So you're selecting a student from a table. So what's going on under the hood here is that it's actually analyzing your query and selecting the best search algorithm to find it most efficiently. But you don't have to know what algorithm it's picking. You don't have to know anything about how it's choosing the algorithm. You don't even have to know what a search algorithm is, because like those are solved problems, and that's not really what you care about when you want to find user number 5. So it lets you focus on your own application, your own business logic, and not the low-level problems that have already been solved. So I said HTML has declarative APIs. So this range slider is a good example of that. So when you put this code in your HTML file, you end up with this like magical thing that has all sorts of things going on under the hood. So to actually implement this, what you would have to do if like you were building it from scratch is that you'd have to add event listeners, you've got data binding, there's some styling, you'd have to worry about keyboard access, accessibility, and all these elements that make up what you expect when you have this range slider. But as a developer that uses the input tag that it needs to get the output of a range slider, you don't need to know or care about any of that. All you need to know is that it accepts certain inputs and gives you a certain output. So declarative code is about hiding the implementation details when you just need an interface. So it's sort of like a contract-based development where you have a contract of inputs and outputs. So I don't know, that's super tiny, but we didn't really when we write our own UI code, we don't really learn from this example. We didn't really abstract from what HTML was already doing. I think we sort of didn't really recognize the declarative nature of HTML because you just sort of see it as the way things are. And you don't think about all that implementation detail that's under the hood that actually can get pretty involved. So this is sort of like example of some random custom UI JavaScript jQuery-ish code. It was just like something I Googled, simple jQuery tabs. And so it's just like this short bit of code that's adding and removing classes and setting states and some stuff. Like you've got this very specific HTML structure. It has to be a certain way, and the JavaScript code depends on that DOM structure being exactly this way. And so understanding this code relies on having knowledge of basically 3 different, code bases, but like 3 different sections of your code. You need to know what the HTML is doing. You need to know what the jQuery is doing. You also need to know what's going on in the CSS because some of that logic is in there. So you could wrap this up in like a jQuery library, but it would still depend on weird specific markup being a specific way, and it's still not really very meaningful to read that markup. So if we look at like some of the HTML there, it's not very meaningful to us. Like, what is that even? It's just a link that might or might not do anything. We can't tell why that class current is important. We can like guess, but that's just coincidental. It's not actually like meaningful. We end up having to dump a bunch of information about our DOM into the JavaScript files. So this is code that I may or may not have written. This is pretty much production code. And so it's kind of shitty that our JavaScript has to care a lot about these classes. JavaScript has enough problems with classes. So it's just like, why would your JavaScript need to know about your weird naming convention that you use for your CSS? And then if you look at the bit of JavaScript that well, this is a slightly different example, but same idea. So just a standard bit of JavaScript that's an event listener on a DOM element. So what does like that actual query inside the like jQuery function actually do? So you're going into that big DOM mess that you just created to find this element that we just added. So we're going to go and look for it, even though we already know where it is, because we're the ones that put it there. So we're writing JavaScript like we don't have any control over our HTML, which I guess sometimes is the case, but usually it's not. So we sort of have this idea that our HTML should be dumb and just sort of like this static, pristine thing. But we do all sorts of like weird shit in our JavaScript files to make up for it. So we end up with like this very brittle and tightly coupled code where your JavaScript relies on your HTML being dumb in a very specific way. And if you make it dumb in a different way, it's going to be useless. So it's hard to read and maintain, and you've got sort of implementation details all over the place. So if we think that like maybe some declarative attributes in our HTML are good and maybe we should add more of them, what happens when we do that? So in 2009, Angular was introduced to the world at large, and people were kind of mad about it. I know if you saw Alan's talk yesterday, he used this slide also, but it's unintentional. So this is just like the example from the AngularJS homepage of just like a basic example of how to use Angular. And so the HTML part of Angular made a lot of people pretty angry. So this is sort of like some stuff some people would have said about it. It was ugly, breaking separation of concerns. It's like a step backwards to the days of XML. And so I'm just going to address some of these concerns because I think they can all sort of be overcome. So separation of concerns. So like I said, the separation doesn't really hold. So we have declarative attributes in HTML5 already, or even before HTML5, like the action on a form tag, et cetera. Your content isn't always in your HTML anyways. Like if you're building a JavaScript web app, or even like a non-JavaScript web app, you don't actually have content in your HTML. It's in like a JSON file somewhere, or in a database. And so the sort of nature of the web is that we need to glue our HTML to our JavaScript somewhere. You can't just hope it all works. So you could just as easily say that like you're polluting my JavaScript with all that DOM crap, and maybe that's just as bad as polluting your HTML with all that JavaScript. So I think like you can't really make the argument either way. So I think that we can separate our concerns more intelligently than just by file type. I don't know if that's really the best way to go about it. It just sort of seemed like the logical way to do it, and it's like, I guess, an easy way to teach it. So like with anything in programming, not just in like front end, there's more than one way to separate concerns, and I think we need to sort of like reevaluate that sort of file type division. So inline event handlers also made people really angry, but they're not globals anymore. They're very specifically scoped in the Angular example. They're scoped to a controller, which is also declaratively specified somewhere else in the HTML. Inline event handlers, like, I think a lot of people didn't even hate them at the time. I mean, some people probably liked them because like it's easier to read and reason about. You end up having a lot less code. You don't have to do DOM querying and then event listening, which is a pain. And I would argue that they're really not the biggest mistake we made back then. And then, I didn't actually intend to have only Futurama and Simpsons references in here. It just sort of happened whenever I needed some sort of reaction. So the other argument is just that it looks bad. And that was like, I think one of the most common arguments I've heard is just like, this is ugly. Well, I mean, like, I don't really get the point of this HTML like purity thing. We have this weird purity obsession about our HTML that doesn't really follow into other file types. And I feel like we went through this all with CSS too, with like deciding we weren't going to put classes in our HTML, and then we kind of went backwards on that, and we're doing that again. Thought we decided we were going to be a bit more pragmatic about those things. So just, I think we need to be going forwards on these things. So if we're going to be okay with that, and I hope I've convinced you that we can be, we're going to sort of keep going in that direction. So if declarative attributes are good, then it would be cool if you could make your own declarative attributes. If declarative elements are cool, it would be cool if you could make your own. What if you could yourself make something as useful as like select or an input? So as you've probably heard of, there's this thing called web components. So web components is sort of like with a capital W, capital C, is a set of browser specs that let you sort of teach your HTML new tricks. So custom elements, shadow DOM, templates, and HTML imports. So web component specs, when used together, let you create your own reusable encapsulated UI elements with custom behaviors and styles. So you can create your own tags, expose a public API for them, do all sorts of fancy shit. So this is sort of like an example from that tabs example with the tiny font that I showed earlier. So this would be a better way. So then when I Googled simple JavaScript tabs, if I was just given this, that'd be a lot easier to integrate into my web app than that bunch of code that had me specify my markup in a certain way. So it's meaningful markup. I can read that and know what it means. It's nice and declarative. It's reusable. You can compose it with other elements. So this is just sort of like a basic example of how you create a custom element according to the spec as it was when I first wrote these slides, which was couple months ago, so might be changed. But the point is that the implementation details are all hidden in your like create a callback, and then you'd have like you could add event listeners and like behaviors and an API and all sorts of things that like you wouldn't have to see if you were just using the HTML element. So another cool thing about components is that they're composable. So here, these two elements could come from completely different sources. I could have found one of them on like Google Material Design. I could find one of them I wrote myself. And we just have to know what properties they accept and publish. And we can wire them together really easily. So if you want to use web components, because like there are a lot of advantages to them, it's a little bit complicated. Browser support is not great, and it's kind of all over the place, and no one can really agree, as is sort of the nature with defining new browser specs, especially big, complicated ones like web components. So I don't think there's any browser that currently has the entire spec implemented, and some browsers are saying they're not going to do certain parts of it, which is kind of like your standard bummer situation with browser specs. But there are some options. So Polymer is a set of polyfills and syntax sugar and some default custom elements and what they call polyfills, which are like polyfills for things that aren't technically in the spec, but that will probably be implemented. So it doesn't have like perfect browser support, but it's a lot better than the raw APIs. And so the idea is that you can use web components right now, and it also gives you like a bit more of an abstraction layer on top of web components. So this would just sort of be what like it would look like using the tabs element that you get from Google's like material design library. It's just like a nice, easy to read declarative components. But if you're not into the whole Polymer idea, and some people think it's like too soon, or that like they're not totally sold on it, so the whole philosophy of components at a more abstract level is spread to like all the frameworks pretty much. So you can sort of use them no matter where you are. So Angular has directives. So they let you create new HTML elements, but it doesn't leverage the native browser APIs yet. So the implementation would look pretty much the same as it does in the spec, but the syntax is a bit different now, or will be. And you get like things like scope management and reusability and composability, which you get with the native spec. Angular 2.0 is supposed to support web components out of the box. I'm not really sure what that's going to look like yet, but we'll see. Ember components are sort of similar idea. They're trying to adhere really closely to the spec so that once web components are widely available, you can just swap them in for your Ember components. They look a little bit different because they use curly braces instead of angle brackets, but it's essentially the exact same idea and syntax. And Ember 2.0 is going to make components a much more important aspect of the framework. They're going to be like almost the central abstraction of the framework is going to be components. Like you're not going to have like controllers. You're just going to connect everything using components pretty much. Angle bracket syntax is coming to Ember possibly this week. Didn't check that today, but this week. And then everyone's new favorite, React. React is literally just components all the way down. It's the central like concept of React is reusable declarative components. They're a bit different than the components in like Angular, Ember, or in the spec, because they're not aiming to be interoperable with web components or to like replace them, because like web components are all about sort of like leveraging native DOM APIs, but React sort of the idea is that they have a better solution, which is like not the DOM. It's a virtual DOM instead, which they think is a better idea. But the abstraction is almost exactly the same. So you've got your declarative API configurable with not HTML, but with JSX, which is sort of the same idea. But the focus is the same, reusable, composable components. So sort of prediction for the JavaScript of the future. So instead of like going back and forth between your very specific markup that like is pristine and nice, but like deceivingly complicated, and your JavaScript that's full of DOM querying and event listeners, you're going to be going back and forth between your wiring together of all the components that you've either made or imported from elsewhere, and then maybe you'll be tweaking their implementations or like wiring or adding implementation details under the hood. So there are like limits to declarative programming. I mean, if declarative programming was perfect solution, we wouldn't still be writing with non-declarative languages like most of us do. Sometimes you need to tweak those implementations. Sometimes you do know better. So an example would be, so in SQL, a lot of the times you can count on the right algorithm being used and the most efficient algorithm being used, but sometimes you have to tune that performance and you have to like instruct SQL how to perform the query the most efficient way because you do know better. But usually you don't. Usually you can just let it do its thing. And so sort of like, I think the benefits often outweigh the drawbacks there. So summary, almost perfectly on time here. Sort of like a declarative renaissance of the web. It's coming whether you like it or not. So evidence of that is that Angular's doing it, Ember's doing it, React is doing it, browsers are all doing it, and if everyone else is doing it, you should too. Wouldn't normally make that argument, but it's the web, you kind of can't fight it. But I think you're going to like it because declarative APIs are nice. Meaningful HTML is nice. You get encapsulation because scope is always a big problem in front end. and even style encapsulation with the native spec. You get reusability and composability, which are also big wins. And you sort of can choose your own adventure here. You can use components in your favorite framework. You can try it out with Polymer. You can wait and use the native spec eventually. So I think you're going to sort of pollute your HTML with JavaScript, and I think you're going to like it.